My own daughter sat me down in my living room and told me I had no meaning in this house anymore. She handed me papers to sign away the home I helped buy and a brochure for the nursing home she'd already picked out. They even had a notary scheduled for that night, thinking I was too old and frail to fight back. But they forgot one little thing, a secret document I signed 20 years ago. And when they finally found out what it was, their entire world came crashing down. It started on a Sunday, the way the worst things often do, wrapped in the comforting disguise of routine. The scent of my pot roast, the one Martin always claimed to love, filled the house. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dining room windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air and glinting off the silverware. It was a picture of domestic peace, but like a photograph with a crack running through it. The longer you looked, the more you saw the damage. My daughter Caroline was a whirlwind of brittle cheerfulness. She kept fluffing the throw pillows and adjusting the flowers on the table, her hands never still. She'd ask me how I was feeling if my arthritis was bothering me. Her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. She was performing the role of the dutiful daughter, but she'd forgotten her lines. Her eyes, when they met mine, were like a stranger's at a bus stop. They saw me, but they were already looking past me toward a destination I wasn't invited to. Martin was worse. He sat like a coiled spring at the table, his silence a heavy, suffocating blanket. Every time his phone buzzed on the table, a vibration only he seemed to feel, his whole body would jolt. He barely touched his food, and his eyes kept darting around the living room, not with nostalgia, but with the cold, calculating gaze of an appraiser. It wasn't our home he was seeing. It was an asset. I'm 72 and you don't get to my age without learning to read the silences. Theirs was screaming. I saw the slight tremor in Martin's hand as he refilled my water glass, a gesture of care that felt like a lie. The performance unraveled completely over the next 2 days. My house began to feel smaller, the walls closing in. My dear friend Frances called on Monday as she always does, but Caroline answered. I heard her from the kitchen, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she explained that I was napping and shouldn't be disturbed. An hour later, she told another friend I wasn't feeling up to it. When I mentioned my daily walk to the post office, a small ritual that anchors my day, she forbade it. She'd discovered a dangerous crack in the sidewalk, a hazard my feet had navigated for 20 years without incident. She said it was for my own protection. That was the word they began to use for everything protection. Martin's contribution was to install a new security system. Small white cameras appeared in the corners of the rooms, their little black lenses like unblinking eyes. He told me it was to keep me safe so they could check in on me. But I didn't feel safe. I felt watched. The gaze of that camera in the living room felt colder than any winter draft. I was a specimen under a microscope, a problem to be managed. The ambush, when it came, was executed with a chilling corporate precision. They sat me down in my own armchair, the one my late husband Robert had bought me. They flanked me a united front, and Caroline placed a sleek black folder in my lap. It felt heavy, heavier than paper had any right to be. They began their rehearsed speech. Martin did most of the talking using words like proactive transitions and streamlining our family's future. He explained that these were just some simple estate planning updates things to make it easier for everyone down the line. It was a language designed to be both soothing and impenetrable, the kind of jargon that makes you feel foolish for not understanding. There was a power of attorney to manage my health decisions. And there was a quit-claim deed to take my name off the house I'd poured 40% of the down payment into. They wanted to save me from so much trouble and heartache later, they said. But the only heartache I felt was the one blooming in my chest right then, watching my daughter and her husband systematically, lovingly trying to erase me from my own life. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. Years of quiet observation have taught me that you learn more by listening than by shouting. I saw the nervousness behind their polished script, the way Martin's jaw was clenched, the way Caroline refused to meet my eyes for more than a second. I feigned confusion, murmuring about needing my reading glasses and feeling a bit overwhelmed. I bought myself time, the only currency I had left. They exchanged a look of triumphant relief, and I retired to my room, the heavy folder left on the coffee table like a ticking bomb. Later that night, I heard a noise in the hallway. It was Martin, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper, a world away from the calm, controlled man at the ambush. The words sliced through my bedroom door and found their mark. "The deadline is Tuesday. Don't you think I know that—" A pause. "Look, the asset is secured. We're getting the signature tonight. The house situation will be resolved. You'll get your money." The whisper stopped. In the ringing silence, everything became clear. This wasn't about my health or my safety. It wasn't about proactive transitions. It was about a deadline. It was about an asset. And I was the only thing standing in their way. Sleep didn't come that night. It couldn't. My mind was a landscape of betrayal, replaying Martin's whispered words over and over. The deadline is Tuesday. The asset is secured. Each phrase was a piece of a puzzle I never wanted to solve, but with the cold gray light of morning came a clarity that surprised me. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a hard, cold resolve. They thought I was a frail, confused old woman. They were about to find out how wrong they were. I decided to start with the weakest link. At breakfast, I sat across from Caroline, who was pushing scrambled eggs around her plate with a fork. The air was thick with a new kind of tension, the awkward silence of people who had shown their hand too early. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Then I looked at her, arranging my features into a mask of grandmotherly concern, a look I had perfected over decades. I told her I'd had the most awful dream, that I'd dreamt Martin's company was in some kind of financial trouble. The question landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped into a still pond. The effect was instantaneous and exactly what I'd hoped for. Caroline's face, already pale, went completely white. A splash of coffee from her trembling cup hit the tablecloth. She denied it, of course, but too quickly, too loudly. Her denial was a frantic, rambling story about a big new promotion for Martin, something so important that it required a temporary fiscal restructuring of their assets. The words tumbled out of her, a clumsy, unconvincing lie that only confirmed my suspicions. She couldn't meet my gaze. Later, as I sat in the living room under the watchful eye of their little camera, I heard them arguing in their bedroom. The door was closed, but their voices were sharp enough to cut through the wood. Martin's voice was a furious hiss, telling her he had told her to stick to the script. Caroline's was a panicked cry, insisting that I knew something, asking what he had told me. Their frantic, contradictory whispers were all the confirmation I needed. They weren't just villains. They were amateurs, and that gave me an opening. While they were consumed by their own panic, I saw my chance. I slowly got up from my chair, feigning a slight stiffness in my joints, and announced that I was going to get a bit of fresh air on the porch. I promised I wouldn't go far. They were so busy with their damage control that they barely glanced at me, just gave a distracted wave. The moment I was outside, I pulled my coat on and walked. Not toward the end of the porch, but down the steps, and directly to my neighbor Martha's house. My heart was pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Every shadow seemed to hold one of them watching. But the street was empty. Martha let me in without a question, her kind face a welcome sight, and pointed me to her phone. I made a single call to my brother Daniel. My voice was calm, steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. I told him I needed his help. I told him it was about the house, that they were trying to take it. He didn't ask questions. He just told me he understood. That was all I needed. When I returned home, the atmosphere had shifted again. Their panic had curdled into something harder, more menacing. They had regrouped, and their new strategy was to crush any possibility of resistance. They met me at the door. Caroline informed me with a smile that was all teeth that they had hired a companion for me, someone to help me around the house, effective immediately. It was a guard, plain and simple. Then Martin held out his hand and asked for my car keys, explaining it was for my own safety. The final blow came from him. He stood in the entryway, blocking my path, the picture of a man who had regained control. He announced with a forced, chilling finality that the notary was confirmed for 7 p.m. tonight. All this paperwork, he said, would be tidied up then. The threat was no longer veiled, it was a promise. The cage door, which had been closing slowly, was now being slammed shut. And in that moment, looking at the desperate, dangerous glint in my son-in-law's eyes, I understood. Their desperation didn't make them weak. It made them capable of anything. When Martin dropped that 7 p.m. deadline into the air, it felt like a judge's gavel. For a moment, a real physical wave of dizziness washed over me. But then instinct took over. The best way to hide your strength is to perform the weakness your enemy expects to see. I let my body go limp, putting a trembling hand to my forehead and sinking into the nearest chair. I murmured about being overwhelmed, confused by all the legal talk, letting my voice crack just so. It was a masterpiece, if I do say so myself. They bought it completely. They rushed to my side, their faces a mixture of annoyance and concern, and helped me to my room. As they laid me on my bed, I saw them exchange a glance over my head. It was a look of pure relief, the look of two people who believed their momentary panic was over, that their problem had finally been subdued. They were convinced my compliance was now just a matter of hours. They tucked me in like a child and quietly closed the door, leaving me alone in the dark. While they were breathing sighs of relief, my son-in-law was staring into the abyss. In his home office, the one Robert and I had built as a library, Martin was hunched over his laptop. Glowing on the screen was an official email from the bank, its subject line cold and final, notice of foreclosure. His hands were shaking as he frantically clicked it closed, but his phone lit up almost immediately. It was an encrypted text message, a modern-day poison pen letter. The words were few, but they carried the weight of a physical threat. 72 hours. No more excuses. We know where you live. It wasn't just the bank he was running from. He was caught between the slow, grinding gears of the legal system and the swift, brutal fist of a loan shark. He wasn't just trying to save his lifestyle anymore. He was trying to save his skin. But I, of course, knew none of that. All I knew was that I was a prisoner in my own room with a deadline of my own. But I was not resting. The moment their footsteps faded down the hall, I was up. At the back of my deep closet behind old winter coats that still smelled of my Robert's pipe tobacco was a dusty, locked file box. My hands, which had trembled so convincingly just moments before, were steady as I inserted the small key. Inside, beneath old report cards and birthday letters, was a folder simply labeled House. My breath caught in my chest. There it was. The original notarized lien document, the paper crisp and official. Tucked behind it was the carbon copy of the cashier's check for the down payment, the numbers still clear after all these years. This was my proof, my power. I pulled out the old, slightly clunky smartphone Francis had insisted I learn to use. With careful precision, I took clear photos of both documents, the flash, a small, silent thunderclap in the dim room. I attached them to a new message and sent them to Daniel. I typed only 4 words, just as we discussed. As I lay back down, my secret work complete, I heard their voices from the living room just outside my door. Their confidence had returned, and with it a careless arrogance. They were so sure I was defeated, so certain of their victory, that they began to plan their new life aloud. Their conversation was a poisoned dart, each word finding its mark. They argued over whether the kitchen should have granite or quartz countertops. Caroline talked about the trip to Italy they could finally take. Martin mused about a new luxury car. They were dividing up my life, my home, my memories before I was even gone. They were redecorating a house built on a foundation of my love and their betrayal. Lying there in the dark, I felt no more fear, only a cold, clarifying anger. They had given me all the motivation I would ever need. The hours leading up to 7 o'clock were the longest of my life. I stayed in my room, a silent statue, in the dim light, listening to the sounds of my own home being prepared for my disposal. I could hear Caroline humming in the kitchen, a cheerful, tuneless sound that grated on my nerves. I heard Martin on the phone, his voice smooth and confident as he confirmed the notary's arrival. They were actors in the final scene of a play they thought they had written, blind to the fact that the author was about to rewrite the ending. At precisely 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. I rose from my bed and stood in the shadows of my doorway, ready. Caroline and Martin ushered in a small, neat-looking man with a heavy briefcase, their faces beaming with triumphant smiles. They were gracious hosts, welcoming a guest, offering him a drink, making small talk. The notary set up on the dining room table the black folder of my life laid out beside his official stamp. He was just opening it when the doorbell rang again. A flicker of annoyance crossed Martin's face. Caroline went to the door, and her smile faltered. It was my brother Daniel. He was dressed in a sharp suit, a pleasant, easy smile on his face that didn't quite hide the lawyerly glint in his eyes. He said he was just in the neighborhood visiting a client and thought he'd stop by to say hello to me. Before they could form an objection, he stepped inside his presence, filling the room with an authority they could not challenge. He placed his own sleek briefcase next to the notary's, a silent declaration of war. Then he turned to Martin and handed him a crisp, professionally bound document. He explained, his voice still pleasant, that it was a cease and desist, along with a formal notice of the primary lien held on this property. I watched Martin's face as he read the first page. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. The color drained from his skin, leaving a pasty gray pallor. The triumphant smile, the confident posture, all of it crumbled into dust. His hands began to shake so violently that the papers rattled. He stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the room before they landed on me, standing calm and unreadable in the doorway. That was all it took. The dam broke. He turned to Caroline, his voice cracking, and the whole sordid story came pouring out. It was a torrent of confession, a desperate, pathetic flood of truth. He told her about the job loss 6 months ago, the crippling debt he'd hidden from her, the lies he'd told, and finally, the loan shark. He admitted the bank was foreclosing, that the private lender had given him a final, terrifying deadline. He wasn't just trying to get my signature, he was trying to beat a ticking clock that threatened to destroy them completely. He wasn't a monster. He was just a terrified man who had made a monstrous choice. Caroline stared at him, her face a mask of horror. She had known they were in trouble, but she had never imagined this. The danger, the lies, the sheer scale of his failure, it was too much. The shared conspiracy that had bound them together evaporated in an instant, replaced by bitter, ugly recrimination. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a shriek of terror and disgust. She screamed at him, asking him how he could have lied to her, how he could have brought a loan shark to their door. Their united front imploded into a messy, pathetic heap of blame and fear. Throughout all this, the notary sat frozen, a deer in the headlights of a full-blown family war. Finally, he seemed to come to his senses. Witnessing the complete meltdown, He began to awkwardly pack his briefcase, muttering apologies about a family matter. He practically fled the house, eager to escape the toxic fallout of their shattered lives. The shouting eventually subsided, leaving a ringing toxic silence in its wake. Caroline was sobbing in a chair, and Martin stood defeated, a hollowed-out shell of a man. I had watched the entire breakdown without saying a single word. Now I stepped out of the shadows and into the center of the room. I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, but it carried the unquestionable weight of authority that a crisis bestows. I nodded toward the retreating notary and told Daniel he would see our guest out. Then I turned my gaze on my daughter and my son-in-law, who now looked up at me like frightened, misbehaving children. I informed them that tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock we would all be at the bank, and I told them would be the one leading the discussion. I left no room for argument, no space for negotiation. In the space of 10 minutes, the world had been turned upside down. They were no longer in control of their lives, their house, or their future. I was. The night was silent. Not peaceful, but the heavy, exhausted silence that follows a terrible storm. No one spoke. We were three strangers living under one roof, waiting for the dawn. The drive to the bank the next morning was the same. Daniel drove me, and Caroline and Martin followed in their car. I could see them in the rearview mirror, two pale, diminished figures in a bubble of shame. They looked like they hadn't slept at all. Good. I had slept like a stone. The stage for the final act was a glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the bank. It was sterile and impersonal, all polished chrome and dark wood, a place where feelings didn't matter, only facts. I chose the seat at the head of the long table. It felt right. Daniel sat to my right, his briefcase open and ready. To my left sat my dear friend Frances. I had called her early that morning. I needed a witness, not just a legal one, but a moral one. A witness to the history of our families, to the woman she had watched my daughter become. Across from us, Caroline and Martin huddled together, looking small and lost in the cavernous room. A moment later, a formidable woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor entered. This was Ms. Albright, a senior officer Daniel had arranged the meeting with. She took her seat, her expression one of stern neutrality, and the final piece was in place. There was no preamble. Guided by Daniel's calm prompting, I began. My voice was steady, even. I simply laid out the facts, one by one, like placing stones in a row. I spoke of the 40% down payment I had provided all those years ago, and Daniel slid the copy of the cashier's check across the table. I spoke of the private lien, recorded and filed, that secured my investment, and Daniel produced the notarized document. Ms. Albright glanced at it, nodded, and confirmed that the bank had it on file. She stated for the record that any sale, refinancing, or transfer of the property was and always had been impossible without my express written consent. A small, choked sound escaped Caroline. Finally, I detailed the events of the past week, the slow, deliberate isolation, the campaign of psychological manipulation, and the final cruel attempt to trick a vulnerable old woman into signing away her home and her rights. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The cold, hard facts did all the work. The judgment, when it came, was not delivered by me. The true punishment wasn't in any legal declaration, but in the eyes of the two women sitting at that table. Ms. Albright looked at my daughter and son-in-law with the undisguised professional contempt of someone who deals with cheats and frauds every day. She spoke in a clipped, cold tone, informing them that the bank takes attempted fraud against a senior, particularly a primary lien holder, very seriously. It was a brand of shame. They understood the shame of being looked down upon by a figure of financial authority. But the real blow came from Frances. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at Caroline, the little girl she had watched grow up, the daughter of her oldest friend, and her gaze was one of profound, heartbreaking disappointment. It was not anger, it was worse. It was the look of seeing someone you have loved your whole life and realizing you don't know them at all. In that sterile public setting, stripped bare before strangers and friends, their obsession with their public image became their ultimate consequence. Then I delivered the verdict. My voice was clear and steady. The new terms were not a negotiation. They were a declaration. Daniel took the fraudulent power of attorney and the quit-claim deed, and with a quiet, deliberate motion, tore them in half, letting the pieces fall onto the table. I announced that to prevent the foreclosure, and to deal with Martin's other financial entanglements, I would be assuming control of the mortgage payments effective immediately. I would draw from my own savings to make the house whole again. They would be allowed to remain in the house, but their status had changed. They were no longer the owners. They were tenants. They would both find jobs, and a legally binding contract, which Daniel had already drafted, would garnish a significant portion of their income. Part of it would be to pay me rent. The rest would be put into an account managed by me to systematically repay every penny of the debts Martin had incurred. I wasn't evicting them. I was owning them. Their future was now tethered to the consequences of their actions. There was no escape. The justice was absolute, it was proportionate, and it was now their unchangeable reality. The ride home from the bank was the beginning of the new silence. It wasn't the tense, heavy silence of the days before, but an empty, hollow silence. The silence of a verdict delivered. That first evening, we ate our meals separately. We were three ghosts haunting a house that belonged to only one of us. In the weeks that followed, that silence settled in, becoming the new language of our home. 3 months later, that language is all we have. The house is a landscape of quiet, grim routine. The constant stream of friends who used to flock to Caroline's dinner parties has dried up. The phone no longer rings with invitations. When we're in town, I see them. The old friends who now find something fascinating on a shop shelf to avoid her gaze, the neighbors who give a curt nod and cross the street. The town gossip afire first, kindled by Frances's quiet conversations with trusted friends, had found its fuel in my daughter's visible downfall. They are socially ruined, living as specters in a home they no longer own their lives, a testament to the fact that reputation is a glass house, and they had thrown stones from the inside. It's strange how two people faced with the same rock bottom choose to fall in different ways. Martin, to my surprise, has begun the slow, painful work of rebuilding. He found a job with a local construction crew. He leaves before the sun is up his face, grim, and comes home long after it is set, covered in a respectable layer of dust and exhaustion. Daniel found out he's been going to Debtors Anonymous meetings in the next town over, sitting in a church basement with other broken people, trying to piece a life back together. He is humbled. He speaks to me only when necessary, his voice quiet, his eyes always on the floor. He is a man paying his penance. And while forgiveness is not something I am ready to consider, I can see that he is genuinely trying to make amends. Caroline, however, remains trapped in a prison of her own bitterness. She found a job folding sweaters at a department store in the mall, a place where she once shopped with disdain. Her face has become a permanent mask of resentment. In her eyes, this is all Martin's fault for his weakness. It is my fault for my strength. It is everyone's fault but her own. She does her chores, pays her portion of the rent from her meager paycheck, but she moves through the house with a simmering rage that poisons the very air she breathes. She is serving her sentence, but she is learning nothing from it. As for me, I am flourishing. In their downfall, I have found my own liberation. My daily walks with Francis are sacred again, filled with easy laughter. I took the rent money they pay me, the first tangible fruit of my victory, and hired a young, brilliant landscape designer. Together, we are transforming the garden, that patch of earth I was once confined to, into a vibrant sanctuary of my own creation. I've started volunteering at the local library twice a week, where my mind, which my children saw as old and failing, is valued. I am surrounded by books and quiet purpose. I move through my days with a peace I haven't felt in years, the peace that comes from reclaiming what is rightfully yours. This evening, I am sitting on my new garden bench, a gift to myself, reading a book as the sun sets. The air is cool and smells of lavender and freshly turned earth. Caroline approaches from the house, a cup of tea in her hand. She places it on the small table beside me without a word. I look at the cup, then back to my book. I tell her thank you, my tone polite but not warm. I do not look up. She hesitates for a second, then turns and walks back to the house. The gesture was not one of love or of remorse. It was an obligation, the simple required action of a tenant to a landlord. The power dynamic between us is now silent, absolute, and permanent. I pick up the cup and take a sip. The tea is warm. I am at peace in the quiet sanctuary I have rebuilt, a living testament to the fact that true ownership has nothing to do with a name on a deed and everything to do with strength, wisdom, and the enduring will to be free. In the end, the quiet lean on Alice's home served as the story's true moral. It taught a powerful lesson that while fear and desperation can drive people to commit terrible acts, it never absolves them of the consequences. True justice, Alice's story showed, is not always about loud vengeance, but about the quiet, firm reestablishment of truth. She proved that the greatest strength is often underestimated, and that real ownership is not a name on a deed, but the non-negotiable right to live with dignity and peace in a sanctuary you have built yourself.